This week on Dialogue, Congress, the IMF, the World Bank, and the global economic crisis. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guests. Kathryn Lavelle is the Ellen and Dixon Long Associate Professor of World Affairs at Case Western Reserve University. She's a former Wilson Center Fellow and the author of this book, Legislating International Organization, the U.S. Congress, the IMF, and the World Bank. Kent Hughes is director of the Wilson Center's program on America and the global economy. He also directs the Wilson Center on the Hill program. Welcome back. Last time we were together, the economy was a wreck, and nothing's changed since. So it's
more of an international wreck now.
It's spread. Yeah. Let me begin. I'm not going to assume prior knowledge, since it was a learning experience for me to read the book. So let's start with some basics and go back to the origins of both the IMF, the World Bank, and talk about the Bretton Woods agreement. And so, Katie, we can begin with you, and Kent, you can fill in some blanks as well.
Well, I usually go back even a little bit before that,
Sure.
Because for me it all starts with the League of Nations.
Okay.
And the thing that really impressed me when I started doing the research for this book is just how many Americans cared about the League of Nations and how much involvement there was from civil society in the work of the League, even though we didn't really join. So the story that I tell at the beginning is the story of the failure of Congress to ratify the Treaty of Versailles that included our membership in the League of Nations, but then the learning experience that those in civil society as well as those in Congress had when they negotiated the Bretton Woods Agreement to make sure that that time they could actually get it through the legislature. We could take a leadership role in these organizations.
And Kent, describe the Bretton Woods Agreement. What is it, and why did
it really reflected, in addition to, I think Katie's got real insights, and we tend to forget, even here at the Wilson Center, where the League was really, in a way, a product of Woodrow Wilson's thinking and passion, that in addition to the League, there were some lessons that were learned from the Great Depression, that interwar period. There was a lot of competition among countries by lowering their exchange rate, by raising tariffs. So the IMF and the World Bank were really, in part, answers to that, coupled with the mistake that Keynes pointed out, the level of reparations that were demanded of Germany. So the World Bank was meant to be, actually, and was initially, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Instead of reparations, there was reconstruction. Instead of competitive exchange rates, you had an IMF established to have essentially a dollar-based system that was in turn tied to gold. So you had fixed exchange rates. A system was set up to maintain them, at least, and it worked for quite a period, that would avoid this kind of competitive, negative sort of competition.
And Bretton Woods is a geographical place, correct?
Correct.
New Hampshire?
Correct, in New Hampshire.
And is there any significance to the name other than that, or that's just happened to be where they got together to meet?
That's just where they had the conference, but it's the Bretton Woods Conference on United Nations. It was a part of the actual United Nations that won World War II. And I think that it really speaks to the whole essence of political economy, that we know that cooperation among countries is what we need, and we know that cooperation in trade and in finance and in development is really the best policy outcome. But we also know that in politics, it's the most difficult to achieve, because in international relations, one of the central insights of the field is just that countries have more of a stake in pursuing their own interests, and so it's always a hurdle to overcome that barrier. So
I'm sorry, Katie.
No, so that's just the story of Bretton Woods, is the story of overcoming that barrier.
Is the period that you're both describing, is this really the globalization in its infancy, and we just didn't have the term yet?
I absolutely think that it's not just globalization. We talk about globalization from above, and we talk about that now where elites get together. So we see right now in Europe where elites and leaders decide. But I want to argue in this book that globalization also comes from below, that it comes from the efforts of ordinary citizens acting in the United States in interest groups, but then working in global networks to try to affect this kind of cooperation that we all need.
And tell us why you decided to write the book now, and how long it took you to complete it.
Well, I decided to write the book before I was a fellow here. So I was someone who started out studying political economy and stock markets, and I was fascinated by what goes on inside
What year is
America.
this? When did you first get the
when I first worked on the Hill was 2006.
So pre-meltdown.
When the meltdown was just beginning, I was working on the House Committee on Financial Services.
Timing is everything, isn't it?
It was perfect timing if you want to watch one of the greatest catastrophes in world political financial history. It was really the beginning of the housing crisis when I was here, and then I went back to Cleveland where we had the housing crisis occur, and then back here to Washington when I was a Wilson Center fellow when Lehman Brothers collapsed. So it was really the whole end of it with the financial crisis was something that wasn't in the original plan.
The book wrote itself as far as the
right.
ending,
Well,
the
unfortunately, yeah.
Tell us about your time in Washington and time on the Hill. I mean, you were almost an embedded reporter covering the financial scene from the trenches.
Well, I think what it gave me was a way to understand the way the Hill works in a way that political scientists don't generally study it. So most political scientists are interested in legislative outcomes, how bills make it through the House of Representatives. And I'm somewhat of a critic here because a lot of the academic literature only looks at the House and it ignores roll call votes even in the Senate. So it's a strict focus on roll call voting. And the way I see the institution operating in the global community is one where just threatening to legislate or talking about legislating or having a hearing can often have an effect on what happens in the world community, and where our legislature embodies the great debates of the day in world politics as well as in domestic politics. And this is a way we're not accustomed to thinking about Congress, and we don't think about it that way. We think about it in U.S. foreign policy only and not in world politics. So that's really was my original intent in going out to try to look at it, and there really wasn't a lot to draw on other than to go there, work myself, and then go back to the archives, then go back and do the interviews when I was lucky enough to be here, to go back and talk to the people who had been there before I had, to see if the patterns I saw were the same patterns that had persisted throughout American history.
Kent, is it fair to say that reporters in general and authors, maybe less so, but reporters certainly in spot news, miss the story of the human dimension of covering economics? We're always talking about facts and figures and stock market numbers and unemployment numbers, but we often don't really talk about real human beings behind the scenes.
I'd be more generous with reporters than maybe with academics in the economics profession who want to look at a model, want to look at
So you think academics miss it more than...
I think so. One of the things that impressed me so much about Katie's book is she really sees the number of ways in which a member of Congress or a senator can influence the banks or other institutions without actually having a roll call vote. That they may introduce a piece of legislation that is just sending a signal, maybe an angry call to the Secretary of the Treasury, an open letter to the Secretary suggesting we're really concerned about the lack of environmental focus, let's say, at a particular institution. And there will be a reaction. And yet this is often missed if you only focus on roll call votes. I thought she really conveyed to a reader that doesn't know the Congress, and I misspent, as you know, much of my youth working on Capitol Hill, it really conveys how complex the levers can be to really have, nonetheless, some serious influence.
Mm-hmm. What I'd like to do is play off the structure of the book a bit and walk through the various ages and stages of these institutions and their complex relationships by chapter theme. And Kent, I'm going to draw on your expertise. I'll bring them up. Katie, you tell us what is sort of the essential idea, and then Kent, anything you want to add, and by way of commentary or a question, we'll call on you to do the same. So chapter 1 is your congressional advocacy chapter.
Right. Well, here I'm talking about the exchange that takes place between the institution and the international organizations. And on one side, you have the institution of Congress that generally wants some policy change out of the IMF or the World Bank. And on the other hand, you have the IMF and the World Bank that generally just wants the money out of Congress. So how do these two entities come to a resolution so that they both get what they want? And this is generally a process of compromise and talking things out and sometimes going halfway just to get the problem to go away.
Any thoughts, Kent, or a question or anything you'd like to add?
I would absolutely agree, and there's lots of ways you reach a compromise. If you actually have a formal conference committee between the House and the Senate, you'll see that Senator X will agree but wants a serious study or wants a commission or wants a report. and these then become really the currency of compromise.
How much of an issue is this notion of American exceptionalism or even unilateralism in these affairs?
Well, this is something that people in other countries have asked me about. Why should I care about your Congress? And our Congress matters.
They're asking that question here these days.
Yeah, they're asking that question. I know. Maybe if they just did nothing, it would be better. But I think they ask it, but they don't understand the role that our Congress plays as a policy-making body and not just a policy-ratifying body like the European parliaments are. And our Congress supplies the most money. The international organizations are headquartered here, so it's no accident that while there's no formal mechanism for legislatures to interact with these institutions, there's no prohibition on going out for a drink or having an informal meeting or even just socially knowing people. A lot of what happens in Washington is just social interactions among people who have connections among these agencies. And so that whole context within which policymaking takes place is something I think the international relations literature overlooks, the importance of the city and its operations in Washington.
Then we move to the enactment stage.
Well, that's sort of the League of Nations stage, and the Bretton Woods stage, where the goal is to get the legislation.
So now you're actually building the infrastructure to back up the ideas.
Right. Right.
You know, and then the building stage?
So the building stage is one where we've talked about how both institutions, or all three institutions, have changed. Here, Congress is a very closed institution, so it isn't the Congressional Fellowship Program. One of the reasons it started was because people didn't know that much about what went on. So hearings weren't necessarily televised or reported on, so you have a closed institution, but you also have international organizations that reach out to the banking communities and to other communities in American society to see that there's a role. So they make themselves useful to the international banks, and they provide financing for multinational corporations, and slowly the reluctant segments of American society to see them formed come around and become much more willing to participate in their work, but also to press for funding later when they need it.
You know, it's undemocratic, perhaps, of me to even suggest this via question, but, you know, in the pre-C-SPAN days and when there was less transparency for the average person, help or hurt business?
I think probably there's a tendency to think that it would have been much better to cut these deals. You know, what was wrong with the smoke-filled room? Particularly if you barred smoking, it would work just fine. But in fact, I think over the long run, in a democratic society, it's really important for any institution, banking, business, teaching, whatever, to really build their case among the people at large. And if you don't do that, you really long-term are asking for trouble.
You know, the development stage we move into, Katie.
So in the development stage, we have post-colonialism in the developing world, and you have these organizations really reach out to try to enact development programs in the countries where they're operating. And here, Congress starts to open up as well. So interest groups, there's an expansion of interest group activity across the range. So it isn't just in terms of the IMF and the World Bank, but women's groups, environmental groups, the range, and they're different from traditional interest groups insofar as being focused on one issue means that they can cross party lines more. They're not as tied to a certain approach, and so it means that you have an additional layer of political constituents you have to satisfy in Congress to get anything done. So it complicates the process, but it also brought a whole lot more people in who then eventually are supporters or critics of the bank.
From the inside, when you had a chance to sit on the inside and look at this, do we overestimate or underestimate the role that interest groups and lobbyists play in the process?
Well, political science literature debates that, so I thought about it a lot, about whose side. And I tend to agree with the political scientists who argue that interest groups don't necessarily, they approach legislators with whom they already agree. So they don't go and think they're going to change somebody's mind, but they act as kind of an information bureau for the staffs of members where there's already a consensus. And I really saw that going back even to the 40s and the 50s, where you could see in the archival record that interest groups were providing information. Did you catch this op-ed? Did you see this editorial? Did you know that this is going on out in your district or in another district, that this would help you promote this issue? And so they really provide a lot of information and resources to congressional staffs and work with the staffs that they probably already have agreement with.
And then we move to the debt stage. It sounds like we haven't left that stage.
I know. Well, remember, this is the original debt crisis. So this is the debt crisis in 1982, the Mexican default. And so here the IMF, really after the end of fixed parity, really reinvents itself for the first time, where it becomes a bailout mechanism for international banks, what we used to call then the money center banks. And because it's much less popular in this new and improved, or if you want to think improved role, we also see Congress change as well, because members of Congress who want to see funding for the IMF and the World Bank have to use new procedures to get the funding through. So I talk a lot about the rise of omnibus legislation and these packages of bills, where now it becomes more important to get the measure in with the party leadership rather than having broad-based public support for what's going on, so that it's an up or down vote on the entire package, and hopefully your issue isn't the one that catches the attention of the media when it's up for a vote.
Do we learn enough lessons from these past crises, or is it just that things change and even lessons learned aren't a guidepost for you?
Well, it's troubling that we don't learn more lessons than we did. I think we had a lot of warnings. If people were to describe the Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008 as a black swan, meaning unexpected, I think there were an awful lot of black signets along the way, starting with 1982 Mexico and then the LDC debt crisis, savings and loan crisis, long-term capital management and the Asian financial crisis. So there were lots of warnings that the process of deregulating the financial system was bringing lots of risks with it.
Well, what I think is surprising is even the Mexican default was in 1982. There were already congressional hearings on the problem of buildup of debt in developing countries. I want to say as early as 1978, 1979. So these weren't problems that members of Congress and their staffs weren't aware of, were potential problems.
Well, I always think of that, those timelines that you describe when people are debating if this is Bush's economy or Obama's economy, ignoring decades of trends that led us to where we are today. It's so short-sighted.
Good point, John.
The moral hazard stage, this is really interesting to me, where ideology starts to become a bigger factor.
Right, because by the moral hazard stage, you really have the end of the Cold War. So these institutions are now seen much more as a liability. When they intervene, their intervention is seen as the problem and not the solution. So because there's the expectation that they will bail out whomever has invested, be it banks or private investors, then there's the expectation that they will be bailed out, and that creates its own self-fulfilling prophecy that they will in fact fail and they will be bailed out. And so it's the initial idea that you have capitalism on the way out and socialism on the way down, which makes them much less popular on both sides of the political aisle.
Was this the beginning of the hyper-politicization of everything that we're experiencing now?
I would say that the shift wasn't
maybe
just,
one of the early
it wasn't just political,
leads.
But there was a tendency for people to, let's say, be in one movement or another. Mm-hmm. And you saw it, I think, starting with President Reagan's election, not identifying him with it, but a number of the people that were unexpectedly elected, let's say, to the Senate, were not really thinking about the political experience they'd had, because they hadn't really had any, and they weren't used to the need for compromise if you're going to get a very diverse country to move forward. So I would say it started really back in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm. And then when we move to the revived stage with the current crisis and time
the revived stage was sure the one I didn't have planned, because the revived stage
it's actually a very kind word,
no,
revived stage.
They're revived, but I wanted to call them revived.
Desperate stage.
But it is, because I think when I was working on the Hill, there was the whole idea that they were dead, that the IMF was openly grasping for a role in the world economy.
At the end of history, we didn't need a lot of these things. Guess what?
And there were laying off staff for the first time in their history. And then 2 weeks after I got to the Wilson Center, we were talking about a whole new IMF and a new Bretton Woods conference and a new way of having cooperation that would prevent these kinds of crises from occurring again. And so they were revived. But I think the euphoria was also a little bit overblown, because the underlying problems that the old constituencies for these organizations had evaporated. And going forward, I don't see who the main constituents are, other than the Department of the Treasury and a few members of the development community in Washington.
As you both know, several weeks ago, Christine Lagarde, the new director of the International Monetary Fund, made her first major Washington speech here at the Wilson Center. We had a chance to sit down with her afterwards, ask some questions. We're going to take a look at a couple of clips and then ask you to provide some reaction afterwards. In the first, Ms. Lagarde talks about the need or the current slowdown, the slowdown of economic growth.
I'm saying that we've entered into a dangerous phase of the crisis, because we have had some recovery, but unfortunately growth has slowed down, and that has been combined with pressure on the sovereign balance sheets, pressure on the bank balance sheets, and pressure on the households' balance sheets. And all of that sort of feeds into this slow growth. So it's in a way, it's a vicious circle that we need to break to identify a more virtuous circle. I'm not saying that we cannot get out of it. I think that there is a path out of it. There is a path to actually improve this recovery that has begun. But it's time to actually act together and to act decisively. I was very pleased to see that the central banks, for instance, took concerted action this morning to address the liquidity issue in relation to US dollars. That's an example of how people can come together, take decisive action, and have an impact.
Every day when I check the stock reports, I can predict it will be up one day and say stocks rise on Europe hopes, and then it will be down the next day, stocks drop, Europe fears. React to where we are. Is that it? Are we in this yo-yo phase and we're not sure if it's going to hold or not?
Yeah, well, it's the fundamentals that we're talking about here of the structure of the world economy. And I think that what Ms. Lagarde talks about, she's very good when she talks about what countries need to do and what the IMF can do to help the situation. But the problem is that we need to understand how to build support in domestic politics in all industrial democracies for the work of international organizations. So if the IMF is seen as the enemy and we don't see any real mechanism for an international solution to this, then we're going to keep facing the kind of yo-yo economy that I think you're talking about.
Let's take a look at a clip on the need for collective action, and Kent, I'll ask you to comment on that.
In my view, the degree of collective action needs to improve, and we need to restore the momentum that certainly took hold post-2008 Lehman crisis. At the time, whether it was the Washington G20 meeting or the London G20 meeting, there was a collective resolve, there was determined action, there were precise steps that were to be taken, some of which have been taken. But we need to restore that, and we need to really face the issues that we have now in terms of lost confidence, really.
Well, I think she's quite right that it was actually a remarkable degree of international collective action immediately in the wake of Lehman Brothers, and where it looked like not only the United States but much of the financial world was going off the proverbial cliff. There was a response in terms of fiscal stimulus and in terms of accommodating monetary policy.
Which seemed to indicate that we did learn lessons from the past. But why didn't that hold?
That's a puzzle to me. It is one of the challenges is that most of the Western European countries, certainly the United States, looks at the long-term future and realizes there's going to need to be serious deficit reduction. However, in preaching that, it's more difficult to tell people at the same time that they don't need to tighten their belts today, that actually
austerity v. stimulus.
She worries about exactly this vicious cycle of fiscal tightening, more people are underwater in their mortgages, consumer confidence falls, businesses are reluctant to invest, and then you have less tax revenue coming in, there's more austerity and so forth. So that we need to break out of that, and we need to do it in a coordinated, collective way.
Let's take a look at one more clip, and in this she speaks to something that could be part of the problem. The whole issue of how politics and ideology can get in the way of solutions, which you've begun to hint at, Kent. Let's take a look.
The difficulty we have is that the solution is not just black or white. You can't say, stimulus or severe austerity. It's more complicated than that. It's more subtle in a way. And it's a combination of identifying what will facilitate and encourage growth today while anchoring the medium, long-term determination to reduce deficit and stabilize and reduce debt. And it's complicated when you're a political person, and I was one, to actually address that message to your public opinion, to your constituencies. And it's this mixture of a subtle policy mix on the fiscal side and the political environment that is more conducive to black or white decision and partisan action. What is really needed at the moment is this approach to bipartisan understanding of where the problems are and how they can be solved.
You know, since I conducted that interview, I can tell you the question that precipitated that response, and I'll ask the question to both of you. And the question is this a case where we just aren't sure what to do? Or is it a case of where we kind of know what will work, but mustering the political will and rallying people is the problem?
But I think mustering the political will is a little bit more than just telling people what we need to do. In some studies of international organizations, we talk about international organizations as teachers of norms, either be they human rights norms or environmental norms, but carriers of these ideas. And one of the things that impressed me about the earlier initiatives that had taken place with the bank and the fund was that they had played this role in making people understand the connection between the Depression and the lack of economic cooperation. And where I would be somewhat critical of what she said is that we really need to see that from institutions like the IMF to explain to people, so the IMF isn't perceived as the enemy, but the IMF is perceived as a facilitator to a resolution to the problem, and not just kind of the austerity measures are brought in as part of an IMF deal so that national governments don't have to take the blame for what they are imposing on their debtor or their creditor states.
Mr. Hughes, same question.
Well, I think we really have to look to domestic politicians, national politicians, to carry that message even more than the IMF, although I think Ms. Lagarde, Madame Lagarde, is an extraordinarily articulate proponent of doing the right thing. You will hear lots of people looking back at the Great Depression, 1937. Roosevelt listens to the voices that call for, let's cut back, it's time to get rid of that deficit. He tightens fiscal policy, the Fed tightens monetary policy, and we had what many people refer to as the start of the Second Depression. They then reversed course. So I think you would see people in the financial markets, on economics faculty, people who really follow the economy saying, we don't want to do that. We have learned that mistake, but we seem to be pursuing it in any case. So it really, I think, you have to bring home where we're not ignoring the deficit. We understand that's a big problem for America's future or England's future or other major countries. But at the same time, we have to do the right thing now.
Well, thank you for helping us learn more about it through this book and through the discussion today. Kent, thanks to you as well.
I'm already looking forward to reading the next book.
I just worked through this one. I need some time. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.